This British Airways Boeing 747 was cruising at 37,000 feet towards Kenya. With just over 2 hours of their flight remaining, unbeknown to the passengers and crew, this flight was about to take a turn towards chaos when a passenger storms the flight deck and takes control of the aircraft. This story highlights the grit and bravery of the crew and passengers alike, and luckily for us, we are joined by the captain of the flight, Capt Bill Hagan, to share his harrowing experience.
Spread my hand over to feel my way to his eye socket, but unfortunately he bit the very end of my little finger.
You're not going to want to miss this one. On the 28th of December 2000, British Airways Flight 2069 was scheduled to fly from London Gatwick Airport in the UK to Jomo Kenyatta International Airport in Nairobi, Kenya. The weather in the United Kingdom at the time was quite poor, with wintry conditions. This was causing many delays and cancellations of flights across the UK. For the 379 passengers eagerly waiting to board their aircraft, luckily for them, the weather was forecast to be excellent for the route, with clear skies and no turbulence. Not so long before their departure time of 10:30 p.m, the flight crew met to discuss and brief the flight ahead. The captain of the flight was Bill Hagan, who had been flying with British Airways for 28 years, and with him were two first officers, Phil Watson and Richard Webb. All three pilots were very experienced, with Phil and Richard previously flying in the Royal Air Force. For this flight, Richard Webb was acting as the heavy co-pilot, which allowed the crew to take company in-flight rest. Along with the three pilots, there were 16 cabin crew that would be assisting with the flight. The aircraft was due to fly to Nairobi, and whilst there, under the British Airways hub and spoke method at the time, they would fly several shorter flights out of Nairobi. This meant that the majority of the crew would not be returning to the UK for around 11 days. This was a great opportunity for some of the crew's partners and family members to join them for a bit of downtime, and this included Bill Hagan's wife and two children.
I could actually see the departure lounge from where I was sitting in the cockpit. And eventually, after I saw most of the passengers on the way down, I saw the family arriving as well. And Richard went off and made sure that everything was okay there.
The aircraft, a Boeing 747-400, was in good working order. It had been de-iced before the crew arrived, and Captain Hagan checked the technical log for the aircraft and only noticed one defect. The right flap track fairing was missing. This wasn't an issue and meant a small gap would appear next to the extension track of the flap. Captain Hagan informs the crew as a question may be asked by a passenger during takeoff or the approach. Once Captain Hagan and his crew were happy, the passengers started to board the aircraft. Meanwhile, the flight crew began their pre-departure checks and started to set up the aircraft for the trip ahead. Before boarding was completed, the police were seen escorting a passenger to the aircraft. The male passenger and escorting police were met by the senior cabin crew member at the aircraft. The police informed them that the passenger, who was originally from Kenya, had been studying in Lyon, France, and was booked onto this flight to Kenya. He was clearly very nervous about flying and appeared to not be under the influence of drugs or alcohol. They deemed him safe to fly, but he may need a bit more assistance and assurance than an ordinary passenger. But ultimately, the decision to allow him to board lay with the captain. The senior cabin crew member then approached Captain Hagan in the flight deck and briefed him on the situation.
And she also said, there's been a strange one. The police had brought a man down to the side of the aircraft, and he thinks he's being followed. But the police have interviewed him, and they say he's okay to travel. The police say he's okay to travel. No signs of alcohol or drugs. And I turned around and I said, well, who am I to override the police.
Captain Hagan agreed to have the passenger on board, as the police had stated he was fit to fly, and confirmed he was happy with the decision as long as the cabin crew were happy to provide the additional assistance. This was agreed, and the male passenger was escorted to his seat in 32H, with a cabin crew member assisting him with his hand luggage. It was clear that the individual was very nervous, and all the staff were briefed on this to be able to provide additional support if needed. Once boarding was complete, the flight crew finished their final pre-start checks and were ready to depart. For this flight, Captain Hagan would be the pilot's monitoring, with First Officer Watson as the pilot's flying. First Officer Webb would be seated in the third seat for takeoff and was acting as a relief pilot. His duties were to provide additional assistance during the busy phases of flight and to facilitate the taking of company in-flight rest. After a delay of around 40 minutes, Flight 2069 taxied to the taxi holding point before then being released for takeoff. At 23:19, BA Flight 2069 took off from London Gatwick for Nairobi. During the climb, the flight crew carried out their after-takeoff and climb checks, and once they passed 10,000 feet, First Officer Webb, the pilot in the relief seat, started the first of the crew's rest periods. It was determined that between each member of the flight crew, they would get approximately 2 hours of rest before the next crew member cycled through. This allowed for 2 pilots in the flight deck at all times and allowed for crew members to be rested for the final few hours of the flight. First Officer Webb left the flight deck with the remaining crew continuing to climb to their cleared cruise level of 37,000 feet. Once at their cruising altitude, the flight crew settled into the flight with everything going as planned. The only difference in this flight was a flight path that took them over the newly opened Libyan airspace.
A small amount of excitement for me because I've never flown over Libya before. Well, Tony Blair and Gaddafi seem to be pals, and Libyan airspace opened up to worldwide traffic again. Mm-hmm. So I was looking forward to that.
Meanwhile, in the cabin, the restless passenger in 32H was still acting differently to the other passengers. He was regularly getting out of his seat and walking up and down the aisle. This was getting in the way of the cabin crew attempting to carry out their duties. When back in his seat, he would regularly ask the local time in Nairobi, then question passing cabin crew members on the number of passengers on board, the location of the flight deck, the number of male crew on board, and more importantly, when the crew rest times were. The cabin crew could see the individual was very agitated and tried to calm his nerves, still believing he was nervous about the flight. To not interfere with the pilot's duties, none of this information was passed forward to the flight crew. After a few hours, at 0400 UTC, Captain Hagan and First Officer Webb were at the controls. First Officer Watson had just finished his rest period, and it was time for Captain Hagan to finally take a rest. First Officer Watson assumed control of the aircraft, and Captain Hagan headed back to the bunk to get some much-needed rest. A few moments later, back in seat 32H, the agitated individual got out of his seat, folded his blanket and placed his pillow on top, before walking the aisles again. One of the passengers seated near 32H noticed the individual get up and leave before heading forward towards the first class area of the plane. Meanwhile, in the flight deck, the aircraft was just crossing into Sudanese airspace at 37,000 feet. All the systems were in good working order, and First Officer Watson and Webb were in the left and right seats, with Captain Hagan asleep in the bunks behind. First Officer Webb now took this opportunity in the cruise to head down to the cabin to brief the cabin crew on the defect with the flap track fairing. The purpose was to reassure any passengers if they noticed the issue during the descent and approach, which was due to start in the next few hours. This left First Officer Phil Watson alone at the controls. It is worth noting at this point that the flight deck door was not locked at any time during the flight. This was standard procedure at the time. At 04:53, the wandering passenger had made their way to the upper deck in the 747 and was seen loitering around the door to the flight deck, muttering to himself. First Officer Watson, who was focused on monitoring the aircraft systems, then heard the flight deck door close behind him. When he turned around, he saw the passenger stood in the doorway and immediately told him that he was not allowed in the flight deck and he needed to leave. Unfortunately for Phil Watson and the rest of the people on board, these commands were not listened to, and the individual jumped at the controls, grabbing the yoke with both hands on the right-hand seat in front of First Officer Watson. He turned the controls to the full left bank position. This caused the 747 to start to roll to the left with the autopilot disconnecting. First Officer Watson was trying to fight off the intruder, causing the aircraft to enter irregular angles of bank. This caused the aircraft to start to shudder, with the passengers originally thinking they'd hit some turbulence. The mood changed when the aircraft continued to sharply roll to the left, with no indication from the flight deck that turbulence was coming. The seatbelt signs were not switched on and no passenger address was given. In the flight deck, a very different scenario was happening. The intruder had forced himself in between First Officer Watson and the controls, with First Officer Watson unable to see the instruments or even out any of the windows. Phil Watson was fighting hard for control. In this struggle, the aircraft pitched up quite heavily to around 30 degrees nose up. This was a substantial climb, with the aircraft racing through 40,000 feet, with the added issue that the speed was now reducing. For Captain Hagan, he was aware something was wrong. He found himself pushed back and against the wall in his bunk.
I felt it as I was pushed down the bunk, head first, gently of course, but I knew an angle of climb, which equated to the angle of the bunk, and that was several times higher than what a normal climb would have been.
For a few moments he paused, truly believing there were two very competent pilots at the controls, which he could get in the way of if he was to rush out. As the aircraft continued to climb, the speed was washing off. First Officer Watson was trying to pull the intruder off the controls, realizing the situation was getting more critical as more time went on. Eventually they ran out of performance, with the speed reducing, causing the aircraft to enter a climbing stall. This caused the aircraft to excessively shudder before then dropping towards the ground. The nose dropped, and along with it, the left wing stalled, causing a massive roll to the left. The angle of bank increased to 94 degrees, with the aircraft in a knife-edge position, nose diving towards the ground. In the cabin, the passengers were thrown into a banked nosedive. Anything that wasn't strapped down was thrown to the ceiling of the aircraft, before then crashing down to the floor and becoming pinned to their seats as the G-forces increased. For one of the cabin crew, Kim Parker, she hit the roof, and then the impact of hitting the floor caused her to break her leg. In the flight deck, Captain Hagan exited his bunk and could hear First Officer Watson calling for help. Nothing could have prepared him for what he saw next. Phil Watson was fighting with a passenger in the right-hand seat, with the left-hand seat empty, and the aircraft hurtling towards the ground in a nosedive.
And as I opened it, we were in a vertical dive. That's the only way I could describe it. Literally, it was not vertical, but it appeared to be extremely steep.
First Officer Watson was fighting for his life. Captain Hagan then struck the intruder multiple times, trying to free him from the controls.
I hit him around the temples of his right side of his head a couple of times, fully bled my knuckles. I grabbed the jacket which he had on, a Gleason type jacket, very slippery, and it just came right off with absolutely no effect whatsoever.
During this intervention, First Officer Watson was able to start to roll the wings level and reduced the rate of descent. Desperation was increasing in the flight deck. neither pilot was able to pry the Intruder from the controls, and if something wasn't done soon, he was going to crash the plane into the ground, killing all 397 people on board. Captain Hagan was using all of his strength to try and pull the Intruder, but it wasn't working. With the added assistance of Captain Hagan, First Officer Watson was able to level the wings and get the aircraft into a shallow climb. There was a stalemate of physical exhaustion. In the cabin, it appeared that things had settled down. The aircraft had stopped shuddering and the nosedive was over.
It now felt normal to the passengers. We weren't stalling. The attitude of the aircraft was near normal. The engines probably come back now from full thrust and from idle. Full thrust in the time and idle during the descent. And so they must have thought it was over and expected somebody to speak, but we didn't, because the Intruder was still very much on the controls.
For the next 20 seconds, the belief that the terror was over was starting to sink in. The confusing part for the passengers and cabin crew was that no information was put out on the PA system from the flight deck. Unbeknown to the rest of the aircraft, apart from maybe the passengers in the upper deck who could hear the altercation, there was a fight for survival in progress in the flight deck. For Captain Hagan, he had to get the Intruder off the controls. Rather than pulling, he decided to change to short, sharp snatches of the individual in an attempt to loosen the Intruder's grip. The only problem with this was that with every attempt, the Intruder was pulled back, and with him, the control column too.
And I did this again several times. Each time I did it, the control column came back to the stops, fully back. And so very, very quickly, the stick shake was going. Each time I pulled it back, the stick shake was vibrating. So this continued a few times as well.
With every pull, the aircraft pitched up. This again caused the speed to start to reduce. During this time, the pitch increased around 30 degrees nose up. Captain Hagan was putting everything he had into removing the passenger, and at this point, he glanced over to the instruments on the left side and saw the speed reducing below 170 knots. Almost immediately after, the Boeing 747 entered another stall. With the speed low and reducing, and the threats still present in the flight deck, the situation was bleak. It seemed inevitable that the aircraft would enter an unrecoverable stall with someone at the controls actively trying to crash the plane. Nothing had worked up to this point, and if anything, trying to remove the Intruder with physical force was only adding to the problems. Aware that there were 396 people relying on him, including the three most important people to him, his wife, daughter and son on board, Captain Hagan had nothing left to try but to increase the level of violence.
So I thought, that's great. And then that's when I suddenly remembered the family were with me. And that's when I got the inspiration to take my middle finger and reach over for his head to look for his eye. But as this little finger passed his mouth, he took the end of it. Got the eye in, just got the finger in the eye, pushed up hard, and the pain of that caused him to turn around and follow me, or I was pulling him into the area of the cockpit floor where we commenced a quick fight.
It was reported that the aircraft had lost over 18,000 feet and was still in a stalled position. First Officer Watson was now trying to recover the aircraft, whilst Captain Hagan and the Intruder were fighting on the floor next to him.
He was trying to go for my head, perhaps in revenge, and I believe that Richard was back in the cockpit at that stage. But it seemed to me that we could not win the battle against him. He was a strong young man, and I immediately started calling for help.
Almost instantly, after Captain Hagan had called for help, the flight deck door opened and 3 passengers entered. Two of the passengers were from the United States, Henry Bynum and Gifford Shaw, with the final passenger being John Keynes, the partner of one of the cabin crew, Penny Lester. They all helped to restrain the intruder and remove him from the flight deck. Before there was time to think about the situation, the aircraft was still in a vulnerable position.
They grabbed the intruder and I turned and very quickly jumped into my seat because as captain of the aircraft's in a stall, you don't want to be facing the wrong way. You want to see what's going on. So Phil was doing an innocent job, of course, and I was there just to make sure that he was okay. But he handled it very, very well.
There was a quick check to see if Phil Watson was in a fit state to continue. Then once both pilots were content, they went straight into the basic principles of any emergency, which was to aviate first, then navigate, then communicate. First Officer Watson had fulfilled the first criteria by recovering the aircraft in a safe manner, conscious not to overstress anything, and was now back to being fully in control of the plane. Next, the flight crew's attention turned to where they were. During the altercation, they had lost around 19,000 feet over the skies of Sudan, and were now facing back towards Europe. Captain Hagan, who would regularly fly over the mountainous terrain, was quick to check the safety altitude and ensure that they had not descended below the level of any high terrain. Being over Sudan, the highest point in the country was the Dereba caldera, a volcano with a peak of 10,000 feet. This was not a factor, so they initiated a right turn and started heading back towards Kenya. Finally, Captain Hagan needed to communicate with all the necessary agencies. Firstly, he put out a call to all traffic in the area on the emergency frequency of 121.5. He informed all nearby traffic that they had an issue which caused them to descend. They were now climbing back through flight level 280, heading towards Kenya. Part of the communication structure was to keep both the passengers and cabin crew informed of what was happening. Captain Hagan was very aware that the level of fear and confusion in the cabin would be high.
I was pretty exhausted. I don't normally fight with people in the cockpit or the floor. I don't normally indulge in that. And it was in my 50s, so I was out of breath a bit. But I felt that the passengers desperately needed to know that they were safe.
Still heavily out of breath, Captain Hagan addressed the aircraft. He then announced,
"Say a madman's coming to the cockpit and trying to crash the aircraft. But we're going to be okay. He's out of the cockpit now. We're going to be okay. And I'll talk to you when I can." And that's about all I said.
It was believed that if the incident had continued for 4 or 5 more seconds, the aircraft would have rolled onto its back and would have been unrecoverable. In total, the incident lasted around 2 minutes and 30 seconds. The flight crew now took a moment to breathe. Captain Hagan had sustained injuries to his head, ear and right little finger, and small amounts of blood covered their uniforms and the flight deck. Captain Hagan got an update on the status of the passengers and cabin crew. He was informed that 4 passengers appeared to be injured, and one of the cabin crew, Kim Parker, had broken her leg. The flight crew then discussed their options. They could divert to limit the amount of time in the air and get medical attention sooner, but their options were limited. They discussed diverting to Khartoum Airport or perhaps El Obeid Airport, both in Sudan. However, both options were not favoured due to the risk of terrorism at the time. This made the decision quite clear to continue to Nairobi, where the passengers and crew would receive the best treatment and the aircraft could be checked. But the danger wasn't fully over yet. They still had 2 hours of flight remaining, and it wasn't known if the aircraft had sustained any damage during the manoeuvres it had performed during the incident. Captain Hagan contacted the British Airways Crisis Centre and informed them of the incident and that they needed to be activated. This would alert everyone to get as much help to Nairobi for when they landed. The passengers had been through a terrifying ordeal and just wanted to get on the ground safely. The flight's crew were very aware of this, with Captain Hagan ensuring that they put the incident to the back of their minds and focus on getting the aircraft to Nairobi in a controlled and smooth manner. They took a gentle descent without the use of speed brakes. This helped in two ways. It kept the passengers more comfortable, but also reduced the stress on the wings and frame of the aircraft. During the approach, they then tentatively selected flaps and gear before then landing at Nairobi safely. BA Flight 2069 then taxied to the stand and shut down. The flight deck intruder had been held in seat 68A in the upper deck. He was removed from the aircraft and taken away by the Kenyan police. The flight crew, Kim Parker, and the injured passengers were escorted to Nairobi Hospital for treatment. Before leaving the hospital, Captain Hagan spoke with the engineers and informed them,
item number 2 then was please carry out heavy landing check. Item number 3 is carry out turbulence check. And then I made the comment, aircraft flown outside of normal parameters.
The landing wasn't heavy, but it ensured most of the main areas of the aircraft were checked for any overstress. The intruder was taken to the same hospital for treatment, as he had received injury to his right eye and forehead. Whilst at the hospital, Captain Hagan and the other members of the crew were asked if they wanted to see the intruder. This invitation was politely refused. Chaos ensued, with the press, police, and British Airways needing and wanting to speak with the passengers and crew about the incident. It was decided that British Airways wanted to get the flight crew home for a full debrief. It was arranged that the 3 pilots and Captain Hagan's family would return back to the UK. The first class area was cleared of all passengers and reserved solely for them. It also turned out that they would be returning on the same Boeing 747 that they arrived on. The aircraft was inspected for damage, with no damage reported. It wasn't an easy feat to inform his family that they would be returning to the UK on the same aircraft that they had just experienced such a traumatic event on. This was especially true for Bill's son Aidan, who was only 8 years old at the time. After the event, Bill was speaking with his son Aidan about the experience, and they remembered a discussion they had the night before.
I travelled back from Crete Hydro with my son, my young son Aidan, aged 8 at the time. I travelled back from a hotel in Scotland where we spent Christmas, and Aidan was quite taken by one of the movies that was popular at the time, the Titanic, and it had been shown in the hotel cinema. And so on the way back, he was asking me, many people died and that sort of thing, and how did they die? And I said, well, they didn't actually die by drowning. I think the majority of them, it was exposure to the cold seas. And so we listened to that, and then he said, what about shocks? And I said, no, I don't think there were any shocks at the time. Waters were too cold. I've been told that if you are attacked by a shark, if you stick your finger in its eye, you give it enough pain, that'll break off its attack.
Aidan believed that his father Bill got the inspiration to fight off the attacker in the flight deck from his discussion about fighting off sharks, and at 8 years old, he felt in part responsible for saving everyone on the aircraft. This event could have ended very differently if it wasn't for the actions of the flight crew and passengers that stepped in to help. Thanks to their efforts, 397 people were saved. If the individual had been successful in bringing the aircraft down, it would have become the 3rd worst aviation crash in the world at the time. It is also considered one of the most extreme incidents in UK commercial aviation history due to the massive loss of control that the aircraft sustained. So what happened with the flight deck intruder? His name was Kiefer Paul McConey, a 27-year-old Kenyan citizen who was studying in Lyon, France. He remained in hospital shortly after the event and was declared mentally confused and unstable. He was interviewed by the Kenyan police, where he made no demands, but suggested that he was being spied on by fellow students at the university, and that there were several gunmen after him. Doctors at the hospital believed he was suffering from paranoia, and believed he was not trying to hijack the plane, although suicide could not be ruled out. It was later reported that he was eventually released without charge. There wasn't a full independent investigation on this incident. Most of the information came from Capt Bill Hagan himself, and a Freedom of Information request from Capt Hagan. In the response to this request, there were several official correspondence letters between British Airways, the Civil Aviation Authority from the UK, the Aircraft Accident Investigation Branch, and ICAO. So when this incident first took place, the Air Accident Investigation Branch reached out to the Kenyan Doctorate of Civil Aviation and offered their assistance for the investigation that was going to unfold. They were informed that an investigation would not take place as they were treating the incident as a criminal matter, so the Kenyan police were doing the investigation. British Airways itself also carried out an investigation, and they were having regular meetings with the CAA to inform them of any progress and any safety issues that they thought needed to be pushed out to other airlines. The CAA then announced that they would carry out a review of the incident and would publish the findings later on in 2001. Unfortunately, 9/11 happened that year. They did publish the review, however it was not for public eyes, as the safety recommendations were now considered operational security. After the dust had settled and the story had been told, many of the individuals involved were recognised for their bravery. For Bill Hagan, Phil Watson and Richard Webb, they were awarded a Polaris Award in 2001 for their efforts in the incident. The Polaris Award is the highest decoration associated with civil aviation. Captain Hagan was also awarded the Royal Association for Disability and Rehabilitation People of the Year Award. Henry Bynum, one of the passengers who assisted in the incident, received the Order of the Palmetto, South Carolina's highest honor, for his bravery in subduing the man. He was also awarded a Presidential Commendation by Clemson University in 2001. Every investigation to an aviation accident or incident provides something to be learned from. In this case, it showed the bravery of the human spirit to persevere, but also highlighted the need for tighter security for flight decks. I'm so glad that I've been able to share this story with you, and even more grateful that Bill Hagan was able to share the personal details of the event. It's important to remember and study these events to make aviation safer. As many of you will be aware from watching my other videos, I focus a lot on incidents involving general aviation, as lessons can be learnt at all levels. If you have a spare moment, please do assist me by liking the video and sharing it with people who you think will enjoy it. It takes a lot of time and effort to make these videos, so that would really help. I hope you enjoyed this one. Check out my channel for many more videos on aviation accidents and incidents. I hope you're having a great day, fly safe, and I'll see you in the next one.